The year is 1863, and the United States is embroiled in the Civil War. The tide is turning to the Confederacy, and the Union is grappling with heavy losses. European leaders are contemplating recognizing the Confederacy as a nation and supplying them with aid. At this time, blacks were considered inferior, and it was not acceptable for them to join the military. Conflicted over the issue of race, America would struggle for a solution. After Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, a compromise was made, allowing all black regiments to fight with the Union. The first of these experimental regiments was known as the 54th Massachusetts. Before the Emancipation Proclamation, blacks did not fight in the Civil War, often referred to as the white man's war.
On one point of the spectrum, white Americans, and I'm generalizing, not all, but many white Americans viewed blacks as passive and even docile creatures. On another point on the spectrum, white Americans viewed blacks as savage and barbaric beings. So if we think in terms of a spectrum, we have some interesting oppositions. Simple and childlike, cruel, ignorant.
Regarded as subhuman, black people were not allowed voting rights nor citizenship. In Lincoln's first inaugural address, he stated, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." Despite this assurance from their new president, the South seceded. In an effort to keep the border states in the Union and prevent the strengthening of the Confederacy, Lincoln maintained this claim. However, after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery was abolished in rebel territories, and both free black men and slaves were officially permitted to enlist for the North. Radical abolitionist and Massachusetts Governor John A. Andrews proposed the idea of an all-black regiment, which began recruitment for the 54th Massachusetts. Frederick Douglass, a prominent abolitionist who had escaped from slavery, sent his sons Charles and Lewis to serve in the regiment. Over 1,000 black men from Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and even as far as Canada rushed to enlist. However, enlisting was especially dangerous for African American men. An act passed by the Confederate Congress states in Section 4 that every white commissioned officer who shall command Negroes shall, if captured, be put to death or otherwise punished.
It had potentially negative, deadly consequences for the white officers of black regiments. They would not be treated like traditional captives or war prisoners in the event that they were captured on the battlefield. They could be sold like slaves, the white officers of black regiments.
An all-black regiment could lead to slave rebellions, which could destroy the Confederacy. Governor Andrews wanted black officers but was denied. A compromise was made by choosing an officer from a white abolitionist family. Robert Gould Shaw fit all the requirements and was offered to command the 54th Massachusetts. Shaw originally declined this offer, but would later accept after being pressured by his family. He would serve until his death at the Battle of Fort Wagner. Shaw was only 25 years old. As stated by Confederate officer Hadgood, "Had he been in command of white troops, I should have given him an honorable burial. As it is, I shall bury him in the common trench with the Negroes that fell with him." Despite this, his family said he would be honored to lay next to the soldiers he had come to respect so much. Training was especially difficult for the men of the 54th. White spectators would gather to watch, looking for any sign of incompetence. Because of this, the new soldiers strived for perfection. The all-black regiment rose to the challenge, as they were not willing to compromise by failing in this endeavor. By May of 1863, they received their first orders. Rushed to James Island in July, the 54th stopped the Confederate troops. Despite the bravery and success of the regiment, they were still not treated equally to their white counterparts. Although the 54th had been promised $13 a month, they only received $10, a third of which was deducted for uniforms. A letter written by a black soldier reads, "A strange misapprehension exists as to the matter of pay, and it pains us deeply. He distinctly told us that we were to be paid and treated in all respects the same as other Massachusetts soldiers, nor did we grumble because we were not paid the portion of the United States bounty paid to other volunteer regiments in advance. Now that we have gained some reputation, we claim the right to be heard." They made themselves heard by refusing to accept any pay until their pay was equal to that of whites. This caught the public's attention. A newspaper article reads, "If we are ashamed to acknowledge the heroism of the colored troops at Milliken's Bend, at Port Hudson, at Fort Wagner, upon every field where they have been tried, let us at least be manly enough to say to them, we cannot treat you honorably, so go home." After a year of peaceful protest, the regiment was granted equal pay. Inadequate pay did not stop the regiment from achieving greatness. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment is most famously known for the battle at Fort Wagner. Fought on July 18th, it was one of the most devastating Union losses. For 8 hours, the Union assaulted the Confederate fortification, but this did little to weaken it due to its construction. The 54th Regiment was the first to storm Fort Wagner and paid dearly for it. 274 of its troops were killed, captured, or wounded, including Commander Shaw. The total Union loss amounted to 1,515.
At Fort Wagner, the white officers and black soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts undeniably proved themselves, right? At Fort Wagner, in terms of casualty rates, I believe the 54th Massachusetts sustained 50% casualties among black soldiers. But on the battlefield, they undeniably proved themselves.
The 54th would continue to make a name for itself in the Civil War, including at Port Hudson and Milliken's Bend. Black soldiers took great risks to fight for their nation, even if that nation would not appreciate their sacrifice. At this time in history, accepting black people into the military would have been unthinkable. Some white soldiers refused to fight alongside African Americans, and many people were outraged, believing African Americans to be infiltrating the army and taking their jobs.
Charles Douglas stated, "He stepped in front of me with his fist doubled up in my face and said, 'I don't care if you have the uniform on.'"
However, the 54th Massachusetts continued to defy racial stereotypes. This directly resulted in America having more respect for black soldiers and black people as a whole. The actions of the 54th would pave the way for other black regiments such as the Harlem Hellfighters and the Civil Rights Movement, and gain rights for African Americans across the U.S. It was commonly believed at the time that black people were cowards. Even Shaw was unwilling to associate with the regiment at first. In a letter to his fiancée, he stated that, "I thought I ought not to accept it. If I had taken it, it would only have been from a sense of duty. It would have been anything but an agreeable task." Although he was hesitant to command the 54th Massachusetts, the regiment had continuously proved themselves. Shaw was one of the first to come to respect the regiment.
If the African American enlistees sought to prove themselves to white Northerners, then essentially that would have been one of the upsides, one of the byproducts, that truly the Union experiment, and that experiment was no longer experimental. That it was rightful, necessary.
Their sacrifice resulted in more respect for African Americans and allowed for other all-black regiments such as the 55th Massachusetts to fight in the Civil War. Without the inclusion of black regiments, the Union may not have won the Civil War. By 1863, the Union was struggling with heavy losses. The compromise of allowing black troops to fight was critical in helping the Union win. 10% of those enlisted were African Americans. By the end of the war, more than 186,000 black soldiers had enlisted in the Army. Without the contributions of the 54th and other black regiments, slavery would most likely have persisted to the modern day. The country would have been shattered, and the great experiment would have been a failure. In addition, the 54th Regiment was an inspiration for the Civil Rights Movement. Their persistence and bravery was a major influence for those who participated in arguably the most influential fight for African American rights. They also paved the way for African Americans who fought in World War I and World War II, such as the Harlem Hellfighters. America was severely conflicted concerning the conflict of race during the Civil War. Most white Americans at the time believed African Americans to be cowardly and incapable of combat. This racism persisted after the 54th Massachusetts was formed, as people believed them to be taking their jobs. Despite overwhelming disapproval, the regiment defied all odds, not only gaining respect for black troops, but also paving the way for black regiments in World War I and II, and civil rights. Although America had been conflicted over the issue of race, the compromise of black regiments ultimately led to more respect for black soldiers, inspiration for the civil rights movement, and future black regiments.